I was talking with a friend of mine, Bob. He told me he believed in once saved, always saved. Then he added something else. He said he would never really be free from sin in this life because sanctification is a lifelong process. We slowly improve, he said, but we never actually get free from sin until after we die. At first, that sounded familiar. A lot of people say things like that. But the more I listened, the more I realized something deeper was going on. It wasn't just about how fast someone grows spiritually. It was about what salvation actually is. So I asked him a simple question. Let me see if I understand you. You're saying you're permanently saved, but you're also saying you'll never really stop sinning. So something about you is permanently right with God, even though in reality you'll continue living in sin. He thought for a second and said, well, yeah. I mean, I'll grow, but I'll never be sinless. I said, right. But that's not quite the same thing. I'm not asking whether you'll ever be sinless. I'm asking whether you believe you can actually live free from sin's control, because what you're describing sounds like you're saying you can't. He answered, no, I don't think anyone can. That's why sanctification is progressive. We're always struggling. That helped clarify things. I told him, then it sounds like you're separating salvation into two different layers. There's one layer where you're saved, and that never changes. And then there's another layer where you still sin, and that never really gets resolved in this life. He nodded. That's exactly how he saw it. So I said, then salvation, in your view, is a status. It's something declared about you that remains true, even while the reality of your life still includes ongoing sin. He didn't disagree. I continued. That's where I think we're seeing things differently. I don't think salvation is just a status that floats above reality. I think salvation is the restoration of the relationship itself. It's something that actually changes the direction of a person's life. Not perfectly, not mechanically, but really. He pushed back a little. But we still sin. Everyone still sins. I said, sure, sometimes people sin, but there's a difference between saying we still can sin and saying we cannot stop sinning. Those are two very different claims. He paused at that, so I tried to make it clearer. If someone says they still sometimes fail, that's a moral claim. It's about choices. But when someone says they can never be free from sin, that's not just about choices anymore. That's a statement about what they believe they are able to do. That's a statement about human nature. It's basically saying obedience is impossible. Bob leaned back and thought about that. I continued. And once you say obedience is impossible, sanctification can't really mean freedom. It can only mean gradual improvement. You're always struggling, always partially bound. You can never quite get free. So salvation becomes a kind of guaranteed status, while sanctification becomes an endless struggle that never actually resolves. He said, well, yeah, that's kind of how I've always heard it. I said, that's what I'm questioning. Because the New Testament doesn't just say we slowly improve. It says things like being freed from sin, being dead to sin, sin not having dominion, walking in the Spirit and not fulfilling the desires of the flesh. That language sounds less like permanent bondage and more like real freedom, even if a person can still choose wrongly. He thought about that for a minute, so I summarized it for him. I think your view treats salvation as something that is true in status, even if the reality never fully changes. And it treats sin as something you're never actually able to escape. So sanctification becomes a lifelong reduction of sin, but never freedom from it. I see it differently. I think salvation restores the relationship with God in a real way, and sanctification is learning to live in that reality. Sin is still possible, but it isn't inevitable. Freedom is real, even if we sometimes fail. Bob didn't immediately respond, but I could tell he understood the distinction. We weren't just debating how fast someone grows. We were talking about whether salvation is merely a declaration or whether it is a real change that actually makes freedom possible. Bob looked at me and asked exactly what I expected. So are you saying every time I sin, I lose my salvation? I shook my head. No. I think that question itself comes from the same confusion we were just talking about. You're treating salvation like a fragile status that flips on and off every time something goes wrong. He said, well, if salvation is real and not just a status, then if I sin, wouldn't that mean I'm no longer saved? I said, not necessarily. I think you're confusing failure with abandonment. Those are not the same thing. He leaned forward. What do you mean? I said. Think about any real relationship. A son can disobey his father without abandoning the relationship. A friend can fail another friend without ending the friendship. A husband can act selfishly without walking out of the marriage. Failure damages the relationship, but it doesn't automatically destroy it. Bob nodded slowly. So when I talk about salvation as a real relationship, I continued, I'm not saying a single failure means everything collapses. I'm saying salvation is a restored relationship with God, a life that is meant to be lived in alignment with Him. When we sin, that alignment is disrupted. But disruption is not the same thing as abandonment. He said, so then what would abandonment be? I answered, abandonment is when a person turns away at the level of allegiance. It's not a momentary failure. It's a shift in direction. It's when someone stops wanting God's way and returns to living for themselves. That's very different from struggling while still wanting to follow God. Bob thought about that. So you're saying sin is real, but it's not automatically total rejection. Exactly, I said. In your model, because salvation is a fixed status, you're afraid that if it's not fixed, it must disappear instantly. But that's only true if salvation is just a legal switch. If salvation is relational, then it behaves like relationships do. They can be strained, damaged, and even temporarily broken in practice without being completely abandoned. He said, but people could just keep sinning and say they haven't abandoned God. I replied, that's why direction matters. There's a difference between someone who falls and gets back up and someone who stops caring. One is failure within a relationship. The other is walking away from it. Scripture seems to warn about the second, not the first. He sat quietly for a moment. So you're saying sanctification isn't just endless failure? No, I said. I think sanctification is learning to live consistently in the relationship that's already been restored. That includes growth. It includes mistakes. But it also includes real freedom. The goal isn't to sin less while staying in bondage. The goal is to actually live in obedience, even though we still retain the ability to choose otherwise. Bob nodded. So you're not saying perfection. You're saying freedom. Exactly. Freedom doesn't mean you never stumble. It means you're no longer trapped. You can walk rightly. You may fail, but you're not bound to fail. And that's very different from saying you will never be free from sin in this life. He leaned back again. So in your view, Salvation isn't a status that guarantees the future regardless of reality. And it's not something that disappears every time you mess up. It's a real relationship that can be lived in, strained, restored, or ultimately abandoned. Yes, I said. That's exactly how I see it. Bob listened carefully while I laid that out, and I could tell this was the point where things either clicked or broke apart. I said, let me tighten what I mean by relationship, because I don't think we mean something vague or sentimental. When I say relationship with God, I mean something very specific. I mean a person has come into right alignment with their Maker. They're no longer operating out of their own value system as ultimate. They've yielded that. They're now agreeing with God about what is good, what matters, and how to live. Bob nodded. Okay, that makes sense. I continued. So salvation isn't just that God says something about you. It's that something is actually true about you now. Your orientation has changed. Your center has shifted. You're no longer living for yourself as the highest reference point. That's a real change, even if it still has to be worked out. He said, right, and that's where sanctification comes in? Exactly, I said. Sanctification is what Paul's talking about when he says to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That takes time. You don't instantly think correctly about everything. You don't instantly value everything the way God does. There's a process of learning, correction, growth, and refinement. Bob jumped in. But that's why we still sin, right? I said, we still can sin, yes. But that's not the same as saying we must sin. Nothing about growth logically requires constant failure. Learning doesn't require disobedience. It requires correction and alignment. You can grow into consistency without needing to keep breaking the same things over and over. He paused at that. That was a new distinction for him. So I pressed into the relational side. Think about it this way. Real relationships have something built into them that legal systems don't. They have a built-in capacity for repair. If something goes wrong, there's a path back. There's recognition, there's correction, there's reconciliation. That's part of what a relationship is. He said, yeah, like with kids. Exactly, I said. A child disobeys, and what happens? There's acknowledgement, there's discipline, there's restoration. The relationship isn't instantly erased. But at the same time, the disobedience isn't treated as irrelevant either. It matters, and it gets addressed. Bob leaned forward. So you're saying that dynamic exists in our relationship with God? Yes, I said. That's exactly what I'm saying. If salvation is relational, then it includes both alignment and restoration. When something breaks, there is a way to repair it. That's part of the structure of the relationship itself. He thought about that and said, so then sin isn't just automatically covered in the sense that it doesn't matter, but it's also not automatically total rejection either. Right, I said. It matters, but it's also repairable. That's the key. And that whole category only makes sense if we're talking about a real relationship, not just a legal status. I paused, then made the contrast explicit. In your model, sanctification assumes ongoing sin is inevitable. So the system has to protect salvation by separating it into a different category. That's why you end up with a permanent status that stays untouched while real life continues in struggle. He nodded slowly. But in a relational model, I continued, you don't need to split things like that. Salvation is the relationship. Sanctification is living it out. Failure is addressed within the relationship, not ignored, and not treated as total abandonment unless it actually becomes that. Bob sat back again, thinking. So then, he said, you're saying the process is real, but the process isn't defined by failure. Exactly, I said. The process is defined by alignment. It's the gradual bringing of your thinking, your desires, and your actions into agreement with God. Failure can happen along the way, but it's not the engine of the process. It's something that gets corrected, not something that has to keep occurring. He nodded again, slower this time. And that also means, I added, that victory is not hypothetical. It's not just something that exists in theory but never shows up in life. It's actually possible to live in a way where sin is no longer ruling you, even though you still retain the ability to choose otherwise. Bob didn't interrupt. He just listened. So when you say, I'll never be free from sin because sanctification is a process, I finished, I think you're importing something into the idea of process that doesn't belong there. Growth takes time, yes, but growth does not require bondage. And relationship includes not just alignment, but the built-in ability to restore what's been damaged along the way. That time he didn't answer right away. He just sat there working through it. Bob listened, and I could tell he was tracking, but he still had that concern sitting in the background. So I clarified it before he had to ask again. Let me be very precise, I said. I'm not saying a real Christian will never sin. And I'm not saying you won't sin. What I'm saying is, you don't have to. That's what freedom means. He narrowed his eyes a little. That sounds subtle, but it feels like a big difference. It is a big difference, I said. In your framework, sin is inevitable. In what I'm describing, sin is possible, but not necessary. That's a completely different structure of reality. He said, okay, what actually changes then? That's where the renewing of the mind comes in, I said. Before, you were operating on a certain set of assumptions about reality. You believed, functionally, that you had to secure your own life. You had to protect yourself, provide for yourself, make sure you didn't lose. So you shaped your decisions around that. You got what you could, however you could, because that seemed necessary. He nodded. Yeah, that sounds right. But when you come into alignment with God, I continued, those assumptions start to break. You begin to see reality differently. You realize your life is not something you have to secure at all costs. Death is not the end. You're not alone. You're not abandoned. And God's way is not just a rule imposed on you. It's actually the true way things are meant to function. Bob leaned in. So obedience changes? Exactly, I said. Before, obedience feels like loss. It feels like you're giving something up, like you're putting yourself at risk. That's why it's so hard. But once your understanding shifts, obedience stops feeling like loss. It starts to look like clarity, like sanity, like the only thing that actually makes sense. He sat there quietly. I went on. So now you're not fighting yourself to obey. You're not trying to force yourself into something you don't agree with. You actually agree. Your value system has changed. What you once wanted, you don't want the same way anymore. And what you once resisted, you now see as good. He said, so it's not behavior first. It's vision first. Yes, I said. That's exactly it. Behavior follows vision. When you see rightly, you begin to choose rightly. Not perfectly, but genuinely. I paused, then gave him something concrete. It's like before someone has a child. You look at parenting from the outside and think, that's exhausting. Waking up at night, constant care, all that responsibility. It feels like a burden. But when the child is actually yours, everything changes. You don't experience those same actions as burdens in the same way because your values have shifted. You love the child, so what looked heavy now feels right. Bob nodded slowly. So in the same way, I said, when your heart aligns with God, obedience isn't this external pressure you're constantly resisting. It becomes the natural expression of what you now see and value. You're not obeying just because you're told to. You're obeying because you agree. He thought about that for a moment, then said, so sanctification isn't just trying harder over time. No, I said. It's seeing more clearly over time. And as you see more clearly, you live more consistently with that vision. I leaned back slightly. That's why I keep saying freedom is real. Not because you become incapable of sinning, but because you're no longer trapped in a system where sin feels necessary. The compulsion breaks. The illusion breaks. You're able to live differently because you actually understand differently. Bob didn't respond right away. So when you say, I'll never be free from sin, I finished, I think what you really mean is, I'll always have the ability to sin. And I agree with that. But that's not the same as saying you're bound to it. Freedom means you're no longer bound, even if the option still exists. This time he didn't push back. He just sat there, quietly working through the implications. Bob was still thinking, so I kept going, tightening the point so he didn't drift back into the same assumptions. Let me add one more piece, I said. What I'm describing isn't emotionalism. It's not about getting stirred up, having a moment, and then trying to ride that feeling. That doesn't last, and it doesn't actually change anything at the core. He nodded. Yeah, I've seen that. This is about truth, I said. It's about your mind being persuaded. You come to see that God's way is not arbitrary, not restrictive, not something imposed from the outside. You see that it is actually right, reasonable, coherent with reality itself, he said. So it's more like being convinced than being hyped up. Exactly, I said. You're convinced. You've seen Christ. You've seen how he valued the will of the Father, even at cost. You've seen the same thing in the apostles, in people who actually lived this out. And at some point, you're no longer resisting that picture. You agree with it. Bob leaned forward slightly. And that changes what you want? Yes, I said. That's the turning point. Your desires don't disappear, but they get reordered. What used to feel necessary starts to look shallow or even destructive. And what used to feel like a burden starts to look right. Not easy in every circumstance, but right in a way that makes sense to you. I paused, then gave him a simple picture. It's like falling into water. What do? You swim. You don't sit there debating it. You don't need to be emotionally worked up to do it. You just recognize what the situation requires, and you act accordingly. He smiled a little. Yeah, that's pretty automatic. Right, I said. And when your mind has been renewed, obedience starts to function more like that. You see clearly enough that the right action presents itself as the obvious action. Not because you're being forced, and not because you become incapable of doing otherwise, but because you recognize what is actually right. He thought about that. So when you get out of the water, I continued, you walk. You don't need a constant internal battle to decide whether walking makes sense. It's just the natural outworking of understanding your situation. Bob nodded slowly. That's what I mean by victory, I said. Not perfection, not the inability to ever choose wrongly, but a clarity of mind and alignment of values that makes obedience normal. Not rare, not hypothetical, not something reserved for later, but something that can actually characterize your life now. He didn't interrupt. So when I say freedom is real, I finished, I mean that your whole framework shifts. You're no longer operating under the assumption that sin is necessary for survival, or even desirable. You see through that. And once you see through it, you're not trapped by it in the same way anymore. Bob sat there quietly. And that's why I can't say, you'll never be free from sin, I added. Because that assumes the old way of seeing never really breaks. But if the truth actually persuades you, if your mind is really renewed, then a different kind of life is not only possible, it's reasonable. This time he didn't push back at all. He just sat there, turning it over, because now the issue wasn't effort anymore. It was whether he believed that what Christ revealed about reality was actually true.